You're listening to the Crochet Conversations podcast with Inez and Mell, and this is episode 41, How to Fully Utilize Stitch Markers. Hello and good morning or afternoon wherever you are. Welcome back to another episode.
Hi guys, happy Sunday.
Some of you send in lots of really lovely messages wishing Mel happy birthday.
Thank you so much for all the birthday wishes.
I hope you've learned something more about her. And if you're wondering how her birthday weekend went, don't, because her celebrations are not done yet. It's a month long.
Yes, of course, it's the whole of March.
I guess if I get to have a month-long November episode, or not, like a month-long celebration,
right? Yeah.
Like, I guess you get to have it too.
Of course.
And also, I guess people like to know about the people behind like a podcast, because I know for me, my favorite kinds of podcasts to listen to are the ones where it's really raw. It's just you listening to them talk, and you get to find out a little bit more about them.
Yeah. And
so I guess that's why people like to listen to our personal episodes. So I always find it very funny when people say, I want to know about your own projects and your own whips, So if you don't know what we're talking about, in the previous episode, because it was Mel's birthday week, we did an episode all about different facts about her.
Yeah, things I like, things you probably wouldn't know about me. And I'm glad that I got to share that with everybody.
Yeah, and in November, which was my birthday month, I did an episode about facts about me. So, you can just scroll back and listen. Unfortunately, podcasts don't have like different sub-playlists. You know how when you watch YouTube, you can add them to different playlists.
Yeah.
You
can categorize it that way, right?
Yeah, it's unfortunate that podcast formats don't have that.
Yeah, maybe in the future they will have something like that.
Because it would be lovely if I can categorize this. We have like 40. This is our 41st episode.
Yeah.
Categorize them into like personal and then quick questions is in one list.
Yeah,
and
or
then
like
the main episodes.
Crochet projects.
Yeah,
and things
like
like that.
projects or like hashtag Granny Squares or whatever. And I think it would just be easier if people are able to find things easily that way, because we have so many episodes and we intend to continue making this podcast, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So there's going to be more and more episodes. So maybe we should petition who would do it, like Apple Podcasts,
yeah, maybe.
Spotify.
Yeah, and it starts making a difference because we are getting more and more episodes now, right?
Yeah, and now if I have to sort through all of them, that's going to be a nightmare. Oh, I do want to share some exciting news we have this week. It's not just about Mel's birthday, but we just recently did an interview with one of our local newspapers.
Yeah.
I mean, we say local, but it's really one of the national newspapers. And they found us through this podcast. So it's really thanks to you guys for listening. And, if y'all weren't listening, it wouldn't really show up in like the recommended feed or whatever. And so they were trying to do an interview about how crochet is up and coming. And because of the podcast, that was really what piqued their interest, so they contacted us. And it's just exciting because they wanted to talk about why we would choose podcast format
as a medium, right, to share
something that's like crochet. So she thought that we are talking into the podcast and giving you guys instructions for patterns,
like tutorials,
like
right?
tutorials, but spoken tutorials, which is funny because if you listen to one of our previous episodes, like I think it was ideas or like crochet inventions that don't exist.
Yeah,
we did talk about having a podcast just dedicated to reading out the instructions to you.
Yes, right.
So when she found out that that wasn't really the case, I think she too was a little bit surprised, and she said to me, I didn't realize that there's so many things you could talk about with crochet. It's just I guess people don't see crochet as something that there's anything really deeper to discuss. So I think that was what really piqued their interest, and so we had an interview, and the article will come out next Friday. So I think by the time we release our next episode, it would be just nice, just in time to discuss what the article was about and all that. And it was pretty cool because they sent like a photographer over to the studio.
Yeah, to take a photo of us, yeah.
Yeah, so then they took out some of our products out. They took out some of our, some of the crochet tops of clothes that we made. And like we had like a little photo shoot. It was actually pretty fast. It was over in like 20 minutes.
Yeah, I think they were pretty specific
like efficient.
about about what they wanted to take as well.
Yeah, and the photographer had really good instructions
Yeah.
from the interviewer about exactly what she wanted. So that was something that was exciting that happened to us.
Really
Yeah.
excited about that. I mean, I hope that having this exposure on like another medium would help us to reach out to more people, you know?
Yeah, and it's a different audience than what we are used to,
Exactly.
because this newspaper is one of the subcategory of newspapers that it's not in English, it's like in a different language.
Yeah.
So I think it would help reach out to other people like that I would never naturally reach out to. Like I think this is like a Mandarin language newspaper.
correct.
The interview was in English, thank God, because I don't think I can speak in Mandarin, but
Yeah, hopefully she'll be able to translate that.
I hope she'll be able to translate it properly. But I'm extremely looking forward to reading the article when it comes out. So that's our exciting news that we wanted to share with you guys. So I think we have rambled on enough. Let's jump into the episode today. Initially, I was intending to leave this as a quick question, but then I realized that I've gotten this question many, many times throughout my career, right? And it's how do I use stitch markers? So the main question was, what do I do with my stitch markers other than just preventing my stitches from unraveling when I keep them away? So that was the question. But this was not the only question that was submitted. Basically, we had, or I have collected a bunch of questions from people, all regarding stitch markers somehow.
Yeah.
So I thought that I should just talk about one full episode about stitch markers. And in fact, I think I've talked about another stitch marker episode before. One of our really, really, really early ones where it's a stitch marker substitute.
Right, yes, I remember that.
Yeah, so that was like kind of really, really early on, like within the first 10 episodes or so.
Yeah, I think it was about crochet tools. Yeah.
I think it's one of them, or like it was a quick question, like what else I could use.
Yeah.
This will not be a replica of that episode, but really to talk about the function of stitch markers and just give you a little bit more of an insight. It's not too deep. I don't think this episode is going to be too long, but just to give you a little bit more of what you could really do or how you can fully make your stitch markers useful for yourself and for your crochet work. I think it's important to sort of break down the types of stitch markers there are, because to me they serve different functions, right? So let's break down the types of stitch markers. In my opinion, you have the ones that look like a Pac-Man. It's
Pac-Man?
like the circled ones.
Oh, okay.
And there's the others that look like a safety pin.
Right.
So I think there really only is 2 of these. It's just in various forms, okay? Each of them I use for something different. And the terms I'm going to use in this episode are really my own terms, but I'm going to try to define them as best I can. And feel free to use these terms in your own, okay? So to me, the safety pin ones, because they secure and they lock in place a lot better, they serve something that I call non-moving markers.
Okay.
Versus moving markers, which I will use the one that looks like a circle.
The one that's kind of open, right?
Yeah, then you just push it in and it just sort of lets the yarn slide right through.
Right.
Okay, so I'm going to call it the safety pin ones and the circle ones, okay? Just for ease of description. So the safety pin ones, again, like I said, I use them for something that I call non-moving markers. And non-moving markers are stitches that I need to indicate to myself, but on a long-term basis. So things that I don't move very often. It's not like I'm shifting them from one stitch to another in that same row. For example, I will use non-moving markers if I need to indicate, say, maybe the start and end of each row, or if I need to mark the center point of a project, or if I need to mark, between 2 points where I need there to be a space, or things that I need visual references for to give me like a better understanding. So for example, if I'm making, say, a sleeve and I'm making one big rectangle piece, I'm going to indicate the center of where that sleeve is, and it's just going to be there hanging out, chilling, until I'm ready to assemble my sleeve to my sweater top. So then I know exactly how to line out the center section. So it's nothing to do with the actual stitch counting itself, but more like a visual indicator. So this is what I call non-moving markers. Now the next kind of stitch markers we use are the circle ones. Right? So these are what I use for what I deem to be called moving markers. And these are things that I need to count every so often, and I'm touching them all the time. So quick counts, things that need to be removed every so often. For example, if I need to make an increase or a decrease or certain section, or if I'm putting in, something, if I'm trying to find the middle point of a big piece of fabric and I'm moving from row to row, and then I just indicate every row I just move one stitch up, and I know I need to be taking it in and out often, then I'll use the circle ones, because it's too much hassle to be using the
Safety pin ones,
yeah, that's right, the safety pin ones, to be taking it in and out. And I find that if I constantly use the safety pin ones all the time, it actually loosens my fabric a little bit. And I just find that I have to pull a little bit too much on my work, and I don't like it. I want to be able to not even remove the hook from my hand and just use my finger and like just flick off.
Whichever is the most efficient, right?
Yeah, that's right. And so I just want to give another example. Earlier I mentioned the start and end of each row, and I call that non-moving markers. By my own theory, they should be called moving markers because you shift them at the start and end of every row. This is the only exception where you could use either one depending on how big your piece is. Now let me explain. If you are working on a very small piece of work, say maybe that's barely 20 or 30 stitches wide, then you can use the circle stitch markers where you can just easily push in and take out, because from the time you start the row to the time you end the row, it's gonna be barely, how long in between. But if I'm working on, say, like a blanket, and the start of my row to the end of my row could take me an hour, no way in hell I'm using a circle stitch marker. I'm going to use my closed safety pin markers so that I can secure it to my work and not have it fall out.
Yeah, I think that is the main issue, because I've used the open ones before, and they have the tendency to drop out easily.
Yeah, because it's not always so secure.
Yeah.
If you don't try to match the circle ones to your yarn type, say if you're using like a chunky yarn weight, if you're using like a fine yarn weight and you use a much bigger circle stitch marker, it's gonna come out.
Yeah.
And it's happened to me many times, and it's really frustrating to need to be counting your work in the middle of everything when all you want to do is just put in the work and put in the stitch after stitch.
Yeah.
And you've done your counting from the start and you want to just keep that up. It's a pain when stitch markers fall out.
Yeah, exactly. Especially for bigger projects, I think.
And if you're making like clothes, for example, like Mel, you are making clothes right
Yeah.
now, your cardigan. Can you imagine not working with stitch markers? I think
No,
that would
I
be
cannot.
insane.
I think because it takes, especially for projects, it takes a while, right? You're not you're not going to complete it in a day. The
Yeah.
stitch markers are there to indicate all the important points that I need to be aware the next time I pick up my project again, you see.
Yeah, because you're not going to, be counting every time you
Right.
pick up your work. So I think, using the type of stitch marker matters too. So I always tell new students who are learning crochet with me, if you are not sure, it's better to get the safety pin ones where once you close it, nothing can take it out again.
Right,
You're
yeah.
not going to move it along, your lap as you're crocheting and accidentally remove one of the stitch markers because you're using a wrong size of the circle stitch
Right.
markers. So I hope that was clear enough. I hope that I wasn't too confusing with my explanation. So to summarize this small little section regarding the first and final stitch of each row, you can use either one. They can be counted as either moving markers or non-moving markers. That really depends on your project itself. And really that's the whole of crochet, right? You need to decide for yourself what you want it to be and how you want it to look. And so if you decide, despite hearing what I'm saying, if you decide that something else is better for you, you should go ahead and do that, because only you know what works best for you.
Yeah, exactly. It's at the end of the day is what works for you, right?
Yeah, that's right. So just take what I say with a pinch of salt and see if it applies to you. And if it doesn't apply to you, then that's fine also. So now I want to talk about what other ways we can use stitch markers, like what are the common ways that we use stitch markers but we don't, even though we should, because I think one of the common questions I get from a lot of like my personal students is they actually come to me and give me their stitch markers and say that I don't ever use it, so yeah, you can take it, feel free, it's yours, you crochet, you probably need it, take it. And so my response is, wait, you crochet too. Why aren't you using it? You know?
Right. I think that as a beginner, I understand where they are coming from. Initially, I had my stitch markers. I used it only to secure my ends, right?
So that it doesn't unravel, right?
Exactly. And I was thinking to myself, why do I need so many stitch markers?
Yeah.
I only need one. But then as I start to move on to bigger projects and or more complicated ones, I start using so many stitch markers, so I can see why it's a necessary tool.
Yeah, and it really is a necessary tool. I mean, if it wasn't, it wouldn't be something that would be part of a kit. You know, if you were to buy a kit online, they always come with stitch markers because it's such an important part of your crochet work, more so than you think, and it's beyond just securing your ends when you store them away. It's like so much more dynamic and functionable, and people just don't realize that they need it. So, okay, let's move on to this next section where we maybe discuss some of the ways that you could potentially use your stitch markers. And I'm not saying that every project needs it. If you're working on a really small, like mini project, you usually don't need it. Oh, and I have to say that I'm not using any amigurumi in my examples, because I personally don't do amigurumi, so I would never use stitch markers for that just because I don't do that. But if you use stitch markers with your amigurumi work, which I know it's quite common, feel free to write into us and tell us, and I would love to come back and do a part 2 about specifically that. But I will leave it out of this episode because I don't use and I don't do amigurumi in general. Okay, so now that disclaimer is out of the way, let's talk about the different ways that we can utilize our stitch markers. That's not just, making sure your ends don't unravel when you store them. Oh, obviously, that's the number one way that we can use it, but that's clearly not the only way. I don't use stitch markers to secure my ends. It's something that I just never had the habit of doing. Because you know how I have like a Ziploc baggie with the crochet, the work itself, and in that same clear Ziploc bag, I usually have my notes or my written instructions or my pattern in it, and the hook that I need to use for the project.
So you put the hook together with that.
Yeah, so all I do is I just tighten the stitch around the crochet hook and then put it all in the bag.
So if you guys have like 100 hooks to spare, for one hook for each project,
in my defense, I do have a lot of hooks because I do like to, I like to have multiple of that same one hook in case I work on different projects and I know I'm going to lose them. You could go to any section in our house and probably lift up a pillow and find a crochet hook there. So that's me. But the only reason I do that is because I am not afraid of the yarn unraveling. I think initially I would feel a little bit like upset if my work would unravel a little bit. But now that I have a proper way of storing it safely, and I put it, in the Ziploc baggie where nothing can really get into it, not my cat, not my dog, not my niece, not my nephew, nobody, right? If and when a stitch would unravel or maybe like half a row would come undone, I am not concerned with it. I'm just gonna redo. In this grand scheme of a million stitches in one project, having 10 or 100 stitches come out doesn't feel too much of a difference for me.
Okay.
So if it does come out, I'm pretty confident enough that I won't forget what I'm doing and I'll just keep on building.
Right.
But I know of some people who take classes from me that they will not even let one or half a stitch unravel if it's something they're working on.
Yeah.
I had someone who was doing like a shawl, a big, really, really huge shawl, and she was like, I'm not letting any one stitch escape my hook, so the moment she's done, even if it's just to pull out her notes, she would put her hook down, put a stitch marker, reach into her bag, and 2 seconds later she would undo the...
Oh my, I actually can attest to that. I feel like I do that. Yeah, I do that, yeah.
But I mean, aren't you know how to do the stitch, right? You're not worried that you forget how to do the stitch.
I don't think it's really about that. It's more that I have worked so hard to build up the stitches that I just want to make sure that I keep it that way. And I have a way of, building up my stitches anyway. So
Yeah.
I guess it makes sense for me to, if I stop at a certain stage, I'm going to, specifically stop there and stitch marker that point.
I think for me, it's just that I don't feel the pain of losing a couple stitches anymore.
Right.
It's like I'm numb to the pain of it. So if it were to come undone, it's like I'm not gonna sweat the small stuff.
Right.
Just let it come undone. Maybe you'd redo this section even better. You
Yeah.
know?
Okay. And
But-
and you do build up the stitches quite quickly. So yeah.
And I mean, it's how much is really going to come undone, really.
That's true,
You
yeah.
think about it, honestly, an inch, 2 inches, but the maximum would be like 4 or 5 inches. But 4 or 5 inches in crochet work is not a lot,
Yeah.
you know?
Correct.
It's the size of one row of a swatch sample. So
That's true. That's
so
true.
there's no crying, no tears here if my stitches were to come undone. So for that reason, I don't use stitch markers to secure my ends, but you could totally do that if you feel that that works for you, or if you don't have a space to keep them. That's the number one way people use it, and that's the most common way people think that that's all
you
stitch
use the
markers are
stitch
for.
markers for. Yeah.
So let's move on to other ways we can use our stitch marker. I did mention the first and last stitch, and I want to talk about that again because there are a few reasons why you would want to do that. Obviously, firstly, is to not lose that first and last stitch, so that when you come around on the next row, you know exactly where you're putting your crochet hook in.
Yeah.
Right? The stitch marker really indicates to you where the final stitch is, and on top of that, where to insert your hook to make that final stitch, so that you're not confusing the third loop and the back loop as both the loops to
Yeah.
go under.
Yeah. I think that's important. Yes.
Because you know how when you chain up 2 and you start that row and say you're doing a row of double crochets, when you come back around, the work sort of twists a little bit. It faces away from you, and it's always on an angle, a slant away from you. So it's very easy to miss the front and back loops that you're supposed to go under and work into the third loop instead, thinking that the third loop and the back loop is the front and back loop.
Yeah. So what happens in this case? It means that you would miss a stitch. Is that right?
You could either miss a stitch or work your stitch into the wrong place.
Okay, I see.
Having a stitch marker there makes sure that you don't do that. You
Okay.
work not only in the right place, but you actually work that stitch in.
Right.
Because oftentimes especially with the first and last stitch, and this is also if you're not just working on a regular like double crochet, if you're doing a more complex stitch pattern, it's very common that your first and last stitch over tightens as you work along the row.
Right.
And so by the time you get to the last stitch, if you are not familiar with the stitch pattern, if you are pulling a lot, and if your tension is not even, and if you're not familiar with it, there is a very huge chance that your work could over tighten to a point that you can't find that last stitch.
Yeah.
And so having a stitch marker there also helps the yarn from really tightening to a point that you can't even squeeze your crochet hook in.
Right.
It's kind of like a placeholder almost to ensure that there will always be a gap, that once you take it out, your crochet hook has space to go into the stitch and yarn over pull out a loop.
Yeah, I can understand that. I've experienced that before, yeah.
And this is not just the first and last stitch. This could be anywhere. If you need to work into a chain of the previous row and you are afraid that the chain will over tighten, you can easily put a stitch marker into the stitch. While you're on it, while you remember what you're doing, put that stitch marker in this row, so that when you come back around to this point in the next row, and that could be in 1 hour, or that could be in a week's time, or a year's time. You know how whips are.
It will still be there.
It will still be there, and you're gonna remember that I have to do something here. Even if you forget what you're supposed to do, you can't look at a piece of work, of half-finished whip, and see a stitch marker and go, oh, it's there for decoration. No, it's an indication to you, like, hello, you've forgotten something.
Yeah.
In our previous episode for Mel's birthday, we talked about being Harry Potter fans.
Yeah.
And I don't know how many of you guys are Harry Potter fans, but to me, a stitch marker, especially a red colored stitch marker, is like a tiny remembrall stuck to your work, where it's kind of like an indicator. Hello, there's something that's
There's a reason why I'm here, right?
Yeah, there's something that's supposed to be done here. Have you forgotten? And then you can go in and check in with your notes or anything. But it's just a good visual marker for you as well. And speaking of visual markers, I like to use stitch markers to mark certain sections of my work. So let me give you a few examples, okay? If I'm making a holder of sorts that has a handle, I like to use stitch markers to indicate the start of my handle to the end of my handle widthwise. So I would put, 2 stitch markers, and I know that the space between these 2 stitch markers is where my handle needs to go.
Right, okay.
For when I sew it in at a later date. Let's say I'm making the body of the handle or the body of a holder. Let's say it's a bottle holder, right? If I'm making the body of the bottle holder, I don't quite yet have an idea of how thick I want the strap to be. So putting 2 stitch markers there allows me to adjust the width of how I think I want the strap, how thick I want it to be. And then once I'm happy with it, then I can go in and, choose how big or how wide or how thin I want based on my swatch and the number of stitches that I need to do together.
Yeah, right.
So that's one way you can use to mark certain things, to visually point it out for you in a way that you can actually see rather than just imagining it in your head.
Yeah.
Earlier I mentioned the example with the sleeve and the sweater. So if you're making like a crochet top, and you want to add maybe a collar, or maybe you want to add like a border or trim, or just adding sleeves or side panel or a pocket, whatever it is, you can always use stitch markers to line up your work. So if I indicate a stitch mark on this piece and one on the other piece, all I have to do is to make sure the stitch markers line up, and I know exactly where the placement of things are going to be. I don't have to actually count every single stitch all over again. And speaking of crochet clothing, especially if you're making tops or items that has multiple pieces that need to be put together, and you don't know if it's gonna fit you, or you don't know if a section is big enough or it's wide enough, or whether it fits nicely, what I like to do is to use stitch marker exactly like how you would a safety pin, and literally pin the 2 pieces of fabric or the 2 crochet stitches together to temporarily attach the sleeve, for example, to like the top or the bodice, or temporarily attach the pocket, like I was mentioning, to the actual thing itself, so that I can see, and if I don't like it, I can always move it and readjust it until I'm happy with it. Then I start securing them together.
Right, that makes sense, because you have to visualize it to actually see how the
and
end
you have to sort of
you
kind of have to sort of put them together and decide, okay, this is the placement it's going to be, right? But if it's like a top where you need the sleeves, for example, or the front panels of something, you can't just smack them on your body and try to hold it up. It's not going to work. You need some way to hold it together. And before I really used stitch markers to its full capacity, what I would do is I would take a long strand of yarn and just weave it in very, very loosely, so that it stays in place. And then once I've decided on it, I pull that
remove
long
the
thread,
yarn,
and usually I'd use a contrasting color so that I can easily see it. But the problem with that is that if I decide to shift it, I can't. I have to take it
off and redo
shift it, and then re-string that yarn through to hold it in place, and that is so tiresome, especially if you're doing it solo. I have you, I can tell you, can you move it, can you move that back panel to the left or to the right, especially if I'm trying to hold it up on me. But it's very possible that you're going to do this crochet project by yourself. And in that event, you're not going to have somebody else to help you, and making all those minute adjustments to your clothes or your crochet clothing is going to be so difficult if you have to string and unstring them together every single time. So a stitch marker is just the wonderful way of adjusting it bit by bit without needing to entirely pick apart, the different components of your work. And so that's another and one of my favorite ways of using stitch markers. Now, the final way you can use stitch markers is to utilize the color of the stitch marker itself. And I think that the poor color of stitch markers have been so overlooked, so people always think about the physical thing itself and just they think the color is a decoration and don't think too much about it. But I like to indicate to myself what I'm supposed to do based on the color and what stitch marker I use. So I deliberately pick out colors that mean something to me.
Wow, that's actually pretty smart.
Okay, so let me give you an example because I think that this could be confusing to some people. So you know the concept of green, amber and red, right? So green light means go, red light means stop, and amber means, to slow down or to take caution, right?
Yep, yes.
So I like to utilize these color codes in my project. So for me, a green, if I'm going to put a green stitch marker somewhere, it's going to indicate to me that something has to be done here. So it's kind of like a vague description of what I'm supposed to do, but it's like a visual marker of, okay, in here, if it's a green marker, it means I'm supposed to go ahead and do something.
Okay, yeah.
And if I do a red marker, it means I have to stop doing something here. So let's give some realistic explanations, okay? If I'm making, say, a scarf, okay? If I put a green stitch marker in a certain section, it means I know I need to maybe put an increase. If I put a red stitch marker, I know I either need to stop that row there, maybe I need to skip a stitch, maybe I need to decrease a stitch or something that takes away from it because you're kind of like stopping it, right?
Okay, yeah.
And if I'm doing if I put like an amber or some other color, then I know that it's indication of something else. So I like to have a legend with me when I work on my project. Along with my notes, I have a little section where it's personal notes that's specific for this project right now, not something that I can recreate. It's kind of like a post-it that I'll throw away. So I will tell myself, from now on in this project, green signifies an increase, red signifies a decrease or a skip stitch, and if it's amber, maybe I need to work 9 stitches in a row, for example.
Yeah, because it's always different for each work that you're doing.
Yeah, and if you don't like this concept, you can use your own concept, blue stitches for the blue section of the scarf. And if you want to add red yarn to this section to do something else, then I'm going to add a red stitch marker.
Yeah, this is really smart. This is where you can get really creative.
Yeah, and this is like really thinking about stitch markers and how you work, and you need to get very familiar, comfortable with understanding how you function when you crochet. How do you think? How does your brain sort of section things out? And stitch markers are tools to help you section things out. So for me, I know that I don't like reading instructions. I don't like following a pattern. So I would read it, I would understand it, I would make notes of it, and then when I pick up my yarn and hook, I'm not referring to a book. I really try to consume as much knowledge pre-project before if I can. So by the time it comes to actually doing the work itself, I know that, say, the example I gave you guys of an increase and decrease is actually the stitch pattern for a chevron stitch. So for example, if I'm working on a chevron stitch scarf, I know that increases are here, decreases are here, but I don't want to have to be counting and referring to the book every 10 steps or so. So then I would just put stitch markers, and that indicates to me what I'm supposed to do, and that's how I work, and that's how I crochet. And you need to go ahead and figure out what works for you and see if stitch markers can help facilitate that process for you. I will say that not everybody would, this wouldn't work for everybody, because if you don't crochet this way, maybe the stitch markers would just be a hassle for you. But I think for me it works, and I found a way it works, and I'm sure if I do it, I'm sure there are others out there who work the same way. So I really wanted to put this concept out of using stitch markers not for the actual stitch marker itself, but for the color that it can bring to you and what you can use as in terms of visual indication goes.
Yeah, and I think it's so amazing that you have come up with so many ways that we can use a stitch marker. I do want to say that the last one you mentioned, the color
the one
coded,
with the colors,
yeah, I think that's my favorite method of using the stitch marker so far. I think it's just because it's so creative, and I'll probably find a way to use that in my next project.
And I think it's there's so much more to stitch markers than just the physical stitch marker
yeah.
object itself. You know, because I was looking at, you know, how this idea really came about was because I was looking at all the stitch markers I've collected, or rather that has been donated to me over the years, and I'm thinking, there's such a variety of colors, like I wonder what I could do with it. And then I started noticing that some of the stitch marker matched the color of, say, my hook, for example, and I'm like, wow, that's so cute, I should take a photo of it matching, you know. And then that got me thinking, as per my personality, how can I utilize this fully and make it as functional as possible? So that's where the idea really you know, came out.
And I think that's what I like about it, that it's not just simply an indication of to pinpoint something, but it's add on an instructional value now.
It value adds the project itself.
Exactly,
And you know, recently I've been thinking about making my own stitch markers. So I've been adding charms to larger lobster claws and being able to have my own stitch marker with cute little charms here and there. And so stitch markers have been on my mind lately. So having a bunch of stitch marker questions come in, and it's not through the podcast, it's in my own teaching, crochet teaching classes. So this question didn't come from the podcast, but it came from a physical person in real life, like many people. And so to have someone ask me about stitch markers, and then have another person ask about stitch markers, and then one more, while I'm figuring out a charm for my stitch marker, felt too much of a coincidence. So I thought, man, is this an indication that I should have this episode talk about stitch markers?
Yeah, you keep thinking about it, right?
Yeah, and it's like the universe just brought it to me, so now I'm bringing it to you guys. So I hope you guys have found this episode really useful and helpful. I really just want to help make the process a lot smoother for some people, and if figuring out how to use the tools that you have to the best of its ability, I think that would really help, you know, one step in the right direction. So if you have any other questions, you can find us on Instagram or Facebook. We are at Crooked Crochet SG, or you can WhatsApp us at +65 91272743. If you have your own quick questions, or you'd like to say something about stitch markers and you'd like to be part of this podcast, you can send your quick questions via voice notes or voice memo to either WhatsApp or iMessage at the same number. I think we would really love to include your voice notes at the start of each episode. Or you can also email us at crookedcrochetsg@gmail.com. Just send it in as an attachment.
Check back every Sunday at 12 noon Greenwich Mean Time, Singapore time, for new crochet episodes.
And next week, we're going to tell you guys about our interview and how it was when the article came out. So we're very excited about that.
Really looking forward to that,
And I think that about summarizes this episode. I hope it's been useful. I hope you guys have a good week, and we'll see you next week.
See you guys next week.
Bye.
Bye.